funny. The crowd is thinned out over the course of the afternoon. But this is probably the most important topic of the day to me, because as you just heard from the last panel, at the end, it's about the money. Not just about the money, as Jeff said, but can't get shit done without the money. And the money requires exits. It's exciting to sit with you today and chat about this. You're on both sides of the table, I guess, in your career, with Lazada previously and now as an investor, right?
Yes, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about your Lazada experience?
Yeah, so originally I actually worked with investments for a activist investment fund in Europe called Sevian Capital. And then I moved over to retail, and I was CEO for a retail company in Scandinavia. And then I went down to Vietnam in 2012 to found a company called Lazada. And I built it as the CEO here in Vietnam during the first 3 years. And yeah, last week, actually, we sold it to Alibaba.
That's right. Congrats. So I guess drinks are on you this evening.
Yeah, a few.
So let me be a little more specific. So the reason exits matter is not just to pay off the investors before, but it's to pay off the founders and the founding team for their hard work, and I guess unleash you guys for what you can do next. But obviously to get there is a lot of hard work. And I think today I'd like to talk about not just the actual exit process, but everything leading up to that. Growing the business, growing the organization, growing the team. So you started Lazada here, right? So it was like, how many people were here? And I guess as you hit 100 people, which is I guess when you start to hit past the early stage phase, what was it like to build out that team?
The story of Lazada actually started back in Europe. So I was in discussions with two of the main investors of Lazada, which was Rocket Internet and Kinnevik. And they were actually equally big, but Rocket Internet is probably 10 times more known than Kinnevik. But I met them in Stockholm, and they were looking then to build e-commerce in Southeast Asia. It was a very, very kind of rough idea at that stage. And we talked about the different countries, and that it sounded exciting. I had studied in China before, so I wanted back to East Asia. And in the end, I said, I want to go to the country where it's least developed and where you have nobody in the team. And back then, that was Vietnam. So from that discussion to me going down to Vietnam was probably 2 months. And I came here in February 2012, and we started Lazada here in Vietnam. And actually, it's kind of a strange way of starting a company, but we wanted to build something similar to Amazon. That was the overall idea. Of course, a very general, big idea. And we had very specific ideas on how big we wanted the teams or the parts of the teams to be. So, for example, the buying team, we thought we wanted to be in the same categories as Amazon was in. So we wanted to have an electronics team, home appliance team, furniture team, and so on and so forth. So actually, the first 100 people we had within 45 days.
Okay, so 45 days to your first 100 employees. Then, how long did it take to get to 1,000? Were you there when it hit 1,000?
Yeah, and that took longer. So that took probably my duration as a CEO was up to around 1,000 people.
And I mean, obviously, part of it is because you have to wait for the business to catch up to it. But what are the other challenges that you faced around growing the organization beyond the first 100 up to the next magnitude?
Actually, the more interesting steps are in the beginning. So from 100 to 150, 150 to 200, and maybe 200 to 300. Those steps are much more challenging in terms of the infrastructure that you need to build into the organization and the types of leaders and middle management layers that you need to have in the organization. So that is much more challenging than, for example, when you reach 300 to up to 500, 600. That's all the same kind of replicating. But much more challenging to create those middle layers strong enough. And I mean, if I rewind a little bit, from the beginning, when you come down, and this is true for any founder, In the beginning, you are all the roles in the company. So even if you're a guy that starts out your company completely on your own, you are all the roles in the company. You are the accountant, you are the salesperson, you are the HR person, you are even typically the developer, and so on. So your challenge is all the time to carve out parts of yourself and parts of your own, day-to-day stuff that you do, and make it into new full-time roles. And then you recruit people around you.
So is the harder part then carving out the roles or finding the people to fill them? And I know the answer to this, but and how did you go about?
Actually, I think maybe it's a little bit individual. I think some people, actually, my observation would be that some people really struggle to actually make the carve out. Some people really want to hold on to specific areas, that they kind of have a view on what they should be as a company builder or a founder, and that should include, for example, it could be a developer starting a company. He feels that he still should be kind of key in the product development. And at the same time, he wants to be the CEO and maybe a few other roles. And that's not necessarily healthy for the scaling of the company.
So the psychological evolution is actually quite hard as well. Yeah. Okay, great. We have about 20 minutes left, so I want to move on, unfortunately, to the next part, which is growing the customers. So Lazada started in early 2012. The e-commerce market must have been something like $30 million for the whole country, across all players. And now it's, depending on who you ask, between $1 and a few billion. And Lazada is the leader. Lazada and other rocket companies played an integral role in building up Vietnam e-commerce generally, but let's focus on the company first. How did you move from your first thousands of dollars of monthly revenue or GMV to much higher than that? To what extent was it systems that you could take from the learnings from Rocket Internet Group, and to what extent did you have to evolve and learn about the other parts of the Vietnamese markets, since obviously Vietnam is not one market?
I think the first, actually, sometimes I do this because nowadays we're also involved in building new companies here in Vietnam through our venture builder. But sometimes I actually still go back in the Lazada marketing file from the early days in February, and I look day by day how the orders came in. And in the very beginning of Lazada here in Vietnam, we had 10 orders. And today we probably have 50,000 orders per day. And it's a good reminder of the fact that in the beginning, when you start a company, I mean, it's this classic thing about dream big, but start small. It's like, do it extremely concrete in the beginning. Go out and basically hand pick your customers. Okay, where do I find the first 10? Where do I find the first 100? And how do I reach them? I mean, basically, where do they live? And what is the name of those people that are going to buy this? And you go out and pick them one by one. And then, of course, you need to move into a more scalable, systematic approach to it. And I think nowadays you need to think a little bit beyond the conventional channels like Facebook and Google and the paid. It's too expensive. It's very crowded even here in Vietnam. So we did a lot of that, but I think the days for that is also partly over.
Do you have one or two resources you can suggest to the audience if they want to learn more about growth hacking, marketing, scaling on the customer side?
Actually, I don't, I think. I mean,
it's all a trade secret.
No, but this actually changes so much all the time. We start companies on a regular basis, and I see that the game changes all the time. I mean, for example, I take an example from Sweden that is an amazing watch brand that is kind of born online. It's very popular here in Vietnam as well, Daniel Wellington. And they've grown a lot through social media and influencer marketing and so on and so forth. But I think that game is also coming to an end, partly. And there's a new horizon on how you attract consumer interest. And I think that consumer is also catching up and realizing, okay, but just because the superstar is recommending this watch in social media, maybe he or she doesn't really mean that it's a great watch. Maybe he or she was actually paid.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, there's no silver bullet to growing, but there is a theoretical framework and a process that you can put into place, which rocket companies do. I mean, that's one of their strengths, I guess. So maybe the thing that you would share is the Rocket Internet Bible, but you can't exactly share that with them.
I think one important thing, though, to just that's a good point, actually. It's a lot about testing, right? It's a lot about testing what works for your product, in what context. And you test, you see if it catches on, and then you can increase the pace of that. If it doesn't, you discard and you move on. And I think one thing that many people do wrong in this sense is that they don't dare to try something in a slightly more aggressive manner. So you sit and you do something with a relatively too careful way. And you tested something in such a small scale that it had never any chance of succeeding. But rather than that, go aggressive in a shorter period of time. If it works, that's great, you got something. If it doesn't work, move on to the next thing. That would be part of Rocket Bible.
Great. Well, we do, 500 Startups does publish some things. Every investor has different strengths or weaknesses, and one of our biggest strengths is on the sales and marketing side, the growth hacking side, as we often say. If you go online later, you can do a Google search for weapons of mass distribution. It's a play on weapons of mass destruction. Weapons of Mass Distribution is a conference that we've held annually with kind of leaders in growth in the US and other markets coming to San Francisco. Also, our accelerator program starts off with what we call Marketing Hell Week. And actually, these days, we just live stream a lot of those and make that material available as well. So you can Google 500 MHW, I think, and that'll pull up that information. So there's a lot, unlike when Lazada was starting, and especially unlike a decade before Lazada was starting, today there's so much information available. But at the end of the day, you have to test for your own product in your own market. So that's basically what I wanted to make sure they got. Okay. One more quick question. Do you have a particularly interesting, surprising or funny story about something you did to grow Lazada business, like a marketing campaign that you can share that worked or didn't work?
This is maybe not the most innovative thing, but it's on the topic of finding your first customers one by one and actually knowing the names of them. So we in Vietnam had the biggest launch day of any Lazada by a factor of maybe 10 or 20 or something like that. We hit it completely out of the park. And this was only because we knew the name of the first 100 people that were going to buy, and they were all in the office. So we had vouchers with all the employees, ready for our launch day, and they were very attractive vouchers, so they all bought massively. And of course, it's an obvious thing that you can, give good promotions to your employees, but there are some very important kind of things to have in the back of your mind there, that you should know the names of your first customers. You should have validation of whatever you're selling in a way that at least your employees are buying. If your employees are not buying, you have probably a fundamental problem if they don't believe in your product or service.
Cool. All right. So then, Rocket's a little bit of a different story from the rest because you guys just start with a ton of money that the brothers put to you. But you have since had an experience after this as well. So obviously you've gotten exposure to early stage investors, and you are now an early stage investor yourself in some ways. So, and you've also seen the later stage funding. So to share with the audience a bit your observations about the similarities and differences of fundraising from early stage versus later stage investors.
I think I'm mostly passionate about the early stage, just in terms of talking about that, because the early stage fundraising is much harder in many sense than the later stage fundraising. The early stage fundraising, if you just have an idea or you just started your company and you need some money to get it going, I think a very important insight is that this market is extremely and that somebody said in the previous, so true. Most of the professional capital and most of the funds, so to speak, they're not active in this arena. You guys are, but you are one of the exceptions. So most of the investors that you're going to be approaching are private individuals, are friends and family, are random people that you come into contact with. So that, if we call it a market for money, that market is extremely unstructured. So you need to have this in the back of your mind when you go into that process, that you're going to meet a lot of people that tell you, untrue things. They give you false hopes. They will ask for a lot of information. They will waste your time, etc., right? So you need to prepare yourself for that. So you need to prepare yourself in the sense that you need to have a lot of time. If you want that money, you need a lot of time. I would say that typically you need 4 to 6 months to secure early stage funding, like angel funding. And you need to try to filter out people that are just going to waste your time and people that could actually lead to something in the end in terms of being your investors.
Yeah, I mean, we keep a list of all the investors that we know are active, at least, and there are probably some investors we don't know about. But our assessment is that there's about 10 early stage investors actively looking at deals in Vietnam right now, as opposed to later stage, depending on where you draw the line, Series A onwards, I guess. Maybe there are 50 investors. And those 50 are actually, so the 10 are more local. There's obviously a few who fly in and out, but the most active ones are local. On the later stage, we see that most of that is regional. Local, larger investors are still looking at traditional businesses, but the later stage VC money is largely regional. So it's funny. The early stage, in our view, with most other investors, at least early stage investors, are absolutely unstructured, as has been mentioned on the last panel as well. So up to 6 months to raise is frustrating, but that is pretty frequent. We try to, at least at 500, keep it to about 2 months total from initial conversation to money transfer. Obviously, sometimes shorter. Its shortest has been about a month or so, sometimes longer. For later stage, perhaps Lazada didn't have to face it while you were there, but it can take, because it is so structured, it can take also a very long time, 6 to 12 months, if you're lucky. And the due diligence is very, very heavy. I've heard about some firms hiring private investigators to investigate the founders' families as well. I've heard about, obviously, huge binders full of information. So I think that is actually common, but for different reasons in both stages.
Let me, so the process, for example, so in Lazada we raised money roughly 1 time per year, we could say. So first we had Kinnevik and Rocket Internet in, and then we raised money from a range of European VC firms, and then we raised money from Tesco, and then we raised money from Temasek, and then we made it to the exit to Alibaba. And I think a key learning from that is just what Eddie is saying, is that also there, it's a long process because there's high requirements on the kind of the structure of your company, how much documentation is prepared, the backgrounds of founders sometimes are checked. And that is very hard to do overnight. Like if you're going to fix your entire company's documentation overnight or even in a 3-month span, that's quite a big workload if you've been operating for 5 years, let's say. So that's something you need to keep in mind early on, that you structure all of this information. Everything should be in digital copy. Everything should be clean and clear for external investors. Otherwise, they might like you. They might like your business model. They might believe in that you're going to make it big. But the company is not investable because all of this stuff is not in place. And it might be too late to change. Yep.
The sooner you get those all in order, the better, right? All right, let's move to the last part, exits. Just a quick intro for those who are not already familiar. There are two main ways you can exit your company. One is by selling it. That's usually called M&A. You can sell it to companies, you can sell it to funds, you can sell it to individuals. The other way is called initial public offering, or IPO, and it's the listing of the stocks of your company on a public exchange. And you can do an IPO on any public exchange, depending on, as long as you follow the rules. So there's a local Ho Chi Minh Stock Exchange. There's obviously regional exchanges in Singapore, Australia, Japan, and so on, and even in the US. We've heard so far today a couple things. We've heard that IPO as an opportunity here in Vietnam is seen to be pretty limited, but we've also heard that VNG, formerly known as Vinagame, is looking at an IPO on NASDAQ, which would be, I think, the first Vietnamese tech company IPO on NASDAQ. We have heard that exits in Vietnam now account for 20% of all exits in Southeast Asia. But we've also heard that exit values, as Koichi said on the last panel, it's difficult to see anyone buying a startup right now for more than $30 million. $30 million. But then again, now we have Lazada, who obviously breaks that by quite a bit. The initial investment by Alibaba was $1.5 billion, as I understand, and now there's been a further sale beyond that. So there's a big range. I think the first misconception we try to share, and I want Chris to talk about this more, we try to help founders with is, even when you're in the early stages, it is not too early to think about the strategy for an exit, to think about what kind of buyer there might be, or whether you can even IPO. What do you need to do at that point to be attractive as an exit? And that helps define everything along the way. So I'd like Chris, to the extent that you can comment, how did Lazada, I mean, I guess from the very vision setting, but beyond that, how did Lazada think about its exit strategy?
I like to add one more option, actually. You said two options,
Yeah.
and that's right in terms of exit. But I think the founder should always keep the third option in mind, and that's to keep the company. Yeah, you don't need to sell it. You can also build a very good business and keep it. And so if you have those kind of three options always in mind in parallel, I think you stand much stronger. Because if you're building a company that you would be happy to keep in terms of cash flows, in terms of profits, in terms of growth, you don't need to be in a situation where you are desperate to sell or desperate to do the IPO. So actually
that's true, absolutely.
And that's what we thought in the beginning, actually, with Lazada. We always said that we're going to evaluate these three options along the way all the time. But we prepared already from day one for a potential trade sale or for a potential IPO of the company. And during different periods, the different kind of angles were intensified for different reasons. And also depending on how the industry was evolving, the industry of e-commerce in Southeast Asia overall. And as the Lazada group got bigger and bigger, so after a while we were in 6 countries, and we were in need of bigger and bigger capital to keep on growing. If we look back at the last funding round we did before Alibaba, we did with Temasek. So Temasek is probably the world's second, third largest investor in total. And when you have come to that stage of doing so big rounds, so that you're already in the top 3 largest investors in the world, you know that you cannot keep on going like this. Because you know that in 1 more year or in 2 more years, nobody's going to be big enough as a financial investor to keep on funding this company. So then we realized that we need to seek a trade sale instead. So we need to sell the company to somebody who's active in e-commerce themselves. And from a strategic standpoint, Alibaba was perfect. Since Alibaba was, in a country that borders the region. And actually, this was like a dream deal for us and for them. I think we were very happy because we built the company in 4 years, and we could then sell it for then, the last transaction was at $3.2 billion. And, but Alibaba got the company very cheap because they bought Lazada, the leader in a market of 600 million people or 650 million people. And it's right on the border of their own market, China. But 650 million people is almost half the population of China. And Alibaba is valued at 200 billion US dollars. So they bought the market opportunity and the market leader in that market opportunity for 50% more, so additional 50% market size. But they bought it for 1.5% of their own market cap. So I think it's a very cheap price for them.
All right. Well, then drinks are really definitely on you tonight. All right. I mean, we're at the official end time, but we started a little bit late, so I'm going to take 2 minutes back. And basically say, I guess, now you're on the investing side as well. Can you give us a couple bullet points about what key factors besides the scale of the business can a founder have in mind as they optimize across those three options? What can they do, either from the very conceptual phase or all along the way, to make them the most attractive possible?
I think now is actually a very interesting time to be a founder in general, and not only in Vietnam, but also globally, because you've seen this massive inflow of capital generally in the world because the interest rates are so low. So you see this very much in the venture capital world. There's a lot of money looking for new companies to found and so on. And unfortunately, many startup ecosystems, a little bit less in Vietnam, but in many places in the world, there's been an overfunding of companies. And you have ended up with a lot of companies that don't make money and will never make money. And they're basically just in the business of building bigger and bigger user bases or bigger and bigger top lines, so sales numbers, but the math might never work in the end. So if you're starting today, my advice would be to focus much more on the cash flow of the business and how you make it cash flow positive relatively early, so that you actually don't need any investor. You don't need any external money because you can stand on your own, and then in kind of the next phase, you can decide, do I want external money to grow the business? But you already proved the business on a smaller scale, so you know that kind of your backup option is to keep the business as it is. Because today, if you have that kind of base, you're actually a relatively uncommon founder, which is a little bit crazy, but that's the way it is. Most founders are now building just for scale and not for profitability and not for cash flow. So I would be more in kind of the keep camp, or at least start to build to be able to keep.
Yeah. Be sustainable so you can negotiate from a position of cash flow strength, if you can afford to do that, and then scale, obviously great. Tech differentiation, I guess depends on the business, but for us, at least, we know how competitive the market's getting in the stuff we're investing in, so having a technical edge is helpful. There's no such thing as a permanent technical edge, but at least having one that can sustain a lead versus others by 6 or 12 months. And then finally, the team strength as well. Although we call it an exit, often in the case of an acquisition or an IPO, and definitely in the case of you keeping it, the core team will be expected to stay on for a while. So it's not just wash your hands and go. So the commitment of the core team, I think, is also really important. I think that's about it for now. Any resources that folks can read for this?
Maybe not so much. I'm not so much into reading blogs and stuff, but I think just interesting maybe to read up a little bit on venture builder model, and that's what we are doing today. So we're trying to be part of building companies from scratch instead of investing as an external investor. So there's not so much kind of resources and so on, but maybe Google a little bit on venture builder and so on, and you can see how that dynamic works.
Okay. Thanks, Chris, and thank you all. I think it's the end of the evening. Thanks.